The sun over New Mexico was not a friend. It was a hammer, a forge, an unblinking eye of molten brass that bleached the sky to a pale, hazy wash and beat down upon the land until the very rocks seemed to sweat under its relentless glare. Cinder Mesa lay sprawled and broken, a landscape of scorched earth, volcanic scree, and skeletal junipers that clawed at the thin air with fingers of desiccated wood. This was a place that had long ago surrendered to thirst, a place where life was a stubborn argument rather than a joyful song. And through it, Elias Merrick rode alone. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the mesa itself. His face was a roadmap of squint lines etched by 1,000 suns, his hands calloused and shaped by rope and rain. He sat his dun-colored gelding, dusty, with the easy, bone-deep weariness of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. Today, he was tracking a stray calf, a foolish young thing that had wandered from its mother and the meager safety of his small herd. The tracks were faint, almost erased by the persistent wind that whispered across the flatlands, a dry, sibilant sound that carried the scent of dust and distant rain that would never fall here. The world was made of 3 sounds: the sigh of that wind, the rhythmic plod of Dusty's hooves on the hardpan, and the dry, protesting creak of saddle leather. It was a symphony of solitude, and Elias loved it. Silence was honest. It made no promises it couldn't keep and asked for nothing in return. It did not judge the past or question the future. It simply was, vast and unyielding, a reflection of the man who moved through it. He had come to these empty spaces years ago, seeking precisely this, a quiet to wrap around the noisy, broken parts of himself, a land wide enough to contain a grief that had no name. He paused on a low rise, pulling the brim of his sweat-stained hat lower against the glare. His eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned the terrain. The calf's tracks led toward a shallow arroyo, where a scraggly line of ancient cottonwood trees marked the ghost of a seasonal creek. It was the only patch of meaningful shade for miles, a likely place for a lost animal to seek refuge from the punishing heat. As he urged Dusty forward, another sound, alien and wrong, pricked at the edge of his awareness. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the chatter of a rock squirrel. It was softer, more fragile. A sound so faint it was almost swallowed by the wind before it could reach him. A thin, hitching noise, like a breath drawn in pain and then forgotten halfway out. It was a human sound, and in a place like this, a human sound that wasn't a shout or a song was a harbinger of trouble. Elias reined Dusty to a halt, his body instantly still, every sense honed by a lifetime of listening to the land. The horse flickered its ears, sensing the change in its rider. The sound came again, weaker this time, a frayed thread of existence in the immense, indifferent tapestry of the desert. He dismounted, his movements economical and quiet, murmuring a low word to the horse. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard, not out of aggression, but out of a deep-seated prudence. The West taught a man that curiosity and carelessness were often buried in the same grave. He moved on foot, his worn boots making little sound on the volcanic rock. He navigated through the gauntlet of juniper, their branches stiff and sharp, their bark peeling like sunburned skin. The black stones underfoot were hot to the touch, radiating the day's collected fury. As he drew closer to the cottonwood grove, the air grew still, the wind seeming to hold its breath. The sparse shade beneath the trees was not cool and inviting, but heavy, stagnant, thick with a silence that felt different from the clean emptiness of the open mesa. It was a watchful silence, coiled and venomous. And then he saw it. Hanging from the thick, low-slung branch of the largest cottonwood was not a calf, but a person, a girl. Her arms were stretched taut above her head, her wrists bound by a thick rope slung over the limb. Her body was limp, a dead weight sagging in the heat. Her head lolled forward, a cascade of raven-black hair obscuring her face. The tips of her worn moccasins barely brushed the ground, swaying almost imperceptibly, a pendulum marking the slow, agonizing passage of time. Elias froze, the rifle feeling suddenly heavy and useless in his hand. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the details with a grim, practiced efficiency. The scuffed dirt beneath her feet told of a struggle that had ended long ago. But it was the object nailed to the tree trunk above her head that made the blood in his veins run cold. It was a crude plank of wood, splintered and weathered. Scrawled across it in angry, dripping strokes of red paint were the words, "White men don't forgive." The letters seemed to pulse in the heat, a raw, visceral wound on the bark of the old tree. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration, a verdict and a sentence carried out in one brutal act. The air itself felt contaminated, thick with a malevolence that was almost palpable. It settled on his skin like a greasy film, the kind of stillness that precedes a lightning strike. Without conscious thought, his left hand drifted from the rifle stock and came to rest on the smooth, worn handle of the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. It was an old friend, a tool of survival. And in that moment, it felt like the only piece of solid reality in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. He forced himself to move closer, his steps measured, his eyes missing nothing. He could see her more clearly now. She was young, perhaps not yet 20. Her simple doeskin dress was torn and stained with dust and sweat. Her wrists, where the coarse rope bit into her flesh, were raw and swollen, the skin broken and dark with dried blood. He could see the faint, terrible burn marks where the hemp had chafed her skin away. Her lips were cracked and split, a faint smear of crimson at the corners of her mouth. He listened, straining to hear the sound that had drawn him here. There it was again, a shallow, almost imperceptible puff of air, a tiny flutter in her chest. She was still alive, barely. The knowledge galvanized him. The curse in the air, the brutal message on the wood, none of it mattered as much as the flicker of life that stubbornly refused to be extinguished. He sheathed the rifle back on his horse, Dusty having followed him with the quiet obedience of a trusted partner. He drew his knife, the blade, honed to a razor's edge, glinted once in a sliver of sunlight that pierced the canopy. He reached the tree and, with one swift upward slash, severed the rope. There was no finesse in the movement, only a brutal efficiency born of urgent purpose. The tension on the rope vanished with a dull thwack, and her body fell. He was ready for it, dropping the knife and lunging forward to catch her before she could hit the hard ground. The shock of contact ran through him. She was terrifyingly light, as if her bones were hollow like a bird's, and she was burning with fever, her skin radiating a dry, scorching heat that penetrated his canvas shirt. He gathered her limp form against his chest, her head falling back against his shoulder. For a dizzying moment, her eyes fluttered open. They were the blackest eyes he had ever seen, deep and vast and filled not with fear, but with a fierce, primal wariness, the look of a cornered animal that expects another blow. They registered his face, the weathered skin, the tired blue eyes for a single, breathless second. Then the light in them guttered out, and her eyelids drifted shut again as consciousness deserted her completely. Gently, Elias lowered her to the ground in a patch of shade, arranging her limbs with a care that felt foreign to his rough hands. She was so still, her breathing so shallow, that he had to place a hand on her chest to feel the faint, thready rise and fall. He pulled off his own heavy, fleece-lined coat, a possession he valued against the cold desert nights, and spread it over her. The contrast of the rough, trail-worn leather against her fragile form was stark. He took his canteen, uncapped it, and, tilting it carefully, let a few precious drops of water fall onto her cracked lips. The moisture soaked in instantly, disappearing into the parched skin. He did it again, a slow, patient baptism in the unforgiving heat. The shadow of the wooden sign stretched long on the ground beside them, the painted words a silent, screaming accusation at his back. He leaned close to her, his voice a low rumble, a sound meant to soothe. not to startle. "I mean you no harm," he whispered, the words feeling inadequate, absurdly small in the face of such calculated cruelty. "You're safe now." But as the ominous shadow of the sign crept over them like a stain, Elias knew it was a lie. She wasn't safe, and by cutting that rope, neither was he. The journey back from Cinder Mesa was a slow torment, measured in the pained, shallow breaths of the woman slumped against his chest. Elias had managed to lift her onto Dusty's saddle, mounting behind her to keep her from falling. Her body, light as it was, felt like a lead weight, and the fever radiating from her was a dry, oppressive heat that seemed to seep into his own skin. He held the reins in one hand, his other arm wrapped firmly around her waist, his knuckles brushing the rough fabric of her dress. With every plodding step the gelding took, her head lolled back against his shoulder, her black hair, matted with sweat and dirt, falling across his arm. He did not push the horse. To ride fast was to invite jarring pain, and he feared what it might do to a body already so close to breaking. Instead, they moved at a funereal pace, a single, struggling entity against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the setting sun. The sky bled crimson and bruised purple in the west, and the shadows of the junipers stretched into long, skeletal fingers across their path. Elias kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, on the distant, familiar notch in the ridge that marked Dry Lantern Wash. His homestead. It had always been a sanctuary, a place of stark, deliberate isolation. Now, he was bringing the world's violence into it. He could still see the red-painted words on that crude sign. Burned into his memory, "White men don't forgive." It was a poison, and he was carrying a victim of it. He thought of the men who had done this. What kind of man, he wondered, leaves a human being to die like that? It was a cold, slow, boastful kind of cruelty. They hadn't just wanted her gone. They had wanted her found, wanted their message read. His jaw tightened. He was not a man given to rage. His griefs were cold and quiet, but a low, steady anger simmered in his gut. He was no crusader. He was a man who wanted to be left alone with his cattle and his silence. But the desert had a way of testing a man, of laying choices at his feet when he least expected them. You could ride past, or you could cut the rope. He had cut the rope, and now, the consequences of that simple, irreversible act were breathing shallowly against his chest. It was full dark by the time they reached the wash. The only sound was the weary protest of the windmill, its metal blades spinning in the night breeze with a rhythmic, grating screonk, screonk. It was a lonely sound, the heartbeat of his solitude. In the faint moonlight, the cabin was a dark rectangle, a single room of rough-hewn pine logs. Beside it, the barn sagged, its roofline dipping in the middle like a tired old horse. He dismounted, his legs stiff. Easing the woman from the saddle was a challenge. She was utterly limp, a dead weight. He managed to gather her into his arms, her head tucked beneath his chin, and carried her across the packed earth yard. He nudged the cabin door open with his boot. The inside was dark and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, sharp scent of dried herbs. He moved with practiced familiarity, crossing the single room to the narrow cot that was his bed. He laid her down on the thin mattress, her form barely a lump under the moonlight streaming through the single, dirt-caked window. She moaned, a low, animal sound of pure misery, and her body was seized by a violent, rattling shiver. The fever was climbing. For a moment, Elias stood over her, a dark shape in the gloom, feeling a profound sense of inadequacy. He was a rancher, not a doctor. He knew how to mend a split hoof, set a calf's broken leg, or stitch a barbed wire gash. This was different. This was a sickness of the soul as much as the body. He shook off the hesitation. Work was the only antidote to doubt. He moved to the hearth, striking a match. The flame flared, catching the kindling he'd laid that morning. In moments, a small fire crackled, casting dancing orange light across the room, revealing its sparse contents: the cot, a rough planked table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and shelves holding tins of coffee, beans, and flour. He filled a heavy kettle from his water barrel and set it on the stove to heat. While the water warmed, he lit the coal oil lamp on the table, trimming the wick until it burned with a steady, yellow glow. The light was merciless. It illuminated what the moonlight had hidden. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin stretched taut and filmed with a feverish sweat. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, but it was her limbs that held his horrified attention. The dress was torn along the shins, revealing legs marbled with dark, ugly bruises, angry purple and yellow blotches that spoke of kicks or blows. Her ankles were swollen to nearly twice their normal size, the skin puffy and discolored. And her wrists. Dear God, her wrists. The ropes had not just bound her, they had tried to erase her. The skin was gone, rubbed raw to the muscle. A weeping, angry red welted by the coarse hemp, branded into her flesh like a cattle mark. Elias felt a tightness in his chest. He turned away, his movements jerky, and retrieved a zinc basin from a hook by the door. He poured the steaming water from the kettle into it, then added cold water from the barrel until the temperature was just warm. He found a clean rag, a piece of an old linen shirt, and a small, nearly used bar of lye soap. He brought the basin and the rag to the bedside and knelt on the wooden floor. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were open, just barely. They were slits of wary darkness in the pale mask of her face, tracking him, not with fear, not with gratitude, but with a flat, watchful intensity. She did not trust him. She was a rabbit that had been pulled from a snare only to find itself in the hands of the trapper. "Got to clean these," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It sounded too loud in the small, quiet room. He didn't wait for a reply she couldn't give. He started with her feet. Her moccasins were worn through, and he eased them off with a gentleness that belied the calloused strength of his hands. Her feet were small, scratched, and caked with the dark, volcanic dust of the mesa. He dipped the rag in the warm water, lathered it lightly, and began to wash one foot. His motions were slow, methodical, deeply respectful. He cleaned the dirt from between her toes, washed the grime from her bruised ankles, his touch as light as he could make it. He avoided looking at her face, focusing instead on the task, on the simple, physical act of cleaning. He felt the tremors that ran through her, the involuntary flinch when his fingers brushed a particularly tender spot. But she made no sound. She just watched him, her gaze a physical weight. He finished the one foot, dried it on a cleaner part of the rag, and then carefully, so carefully, did the other. He saw the broken blisters from her desperate, futile struggles on the ground, and his jaw set hard. When her feet were clean, he knew he had to tend to her wrists. This would be the worst part. He took a deep breath. "This is gonna hurt," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'm sorry for it." He gently lifted one of her arms. The simple movement made her gasp, a sharp, indrawn breath that was half sob. The rope marks were worse up close, the fibers embedded in the raw flesh. He dipped the rag in the basin again, wringing it out. He didn't scrub. He couldn't. He just dabbed, blotting at the wounds, trying to wash away the grit and the dried blood. Every touch made her body stiffen, a silent scream of agony. He worked as quickly as he could, his own forehead breaking out in a cold sweat. He rinsed the rag again and again, the water in the basin turning a murky, reddish-brown. When both wrists were as clean as he could get them, he fetched a tin from his shelf, a salve of pine tar and lard he used for rope burns on his horses. It was crude, but it was all he had. He applied it sparingly, his touch feather-light. Then he tore another clean shirt into long strips and bandaged her wrists, wrapping the soft cloth gently but firmly, covering the terrible wounds from sight. He finished by propping her swollen ankles on a rolled-up blanket to ease the pressure. She had closed her eyes during the bandaging, her face pale and rigid. He stood up, his knees cracking, and looked down at her. She seemed impossibly small in his cot, a broken bird swallowed by his rough blankets. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, his voice low. She gave no sign of having heard him. There was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the screonk of the windmill outside. He waited a long moment. "All right," he said, just as quietly. "That black hair, I'll call you Raven. Just for now. Just till you can tell me different." It felt important to give her a name, even a temporary one. It made her a person, not just a victim. Raven. He knew she needed space. She needed to feel safe, and his presence in the small, one-room cabin would not allow for that. He banked the fire, ensuring it was safe but would provide a low warmth against the desert night's chill. He took his Winchester from its pegs by the door and grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat. "I'll be in the barn," he told her, though he wasn't sure she was conscious to hear. "You're safe. No one's coming here." He stepped outside, pulling the heavy door shut with a quiet thud. The night air was cold and clean, and he breathed it in deeply. He crossed the yard to the sagging barn, the familiar smells of hay, leather, and horse greeting him. He didn't go to the small bunk he kept in the tack room. Instead, he sat on a bale of hay just inside the main door, his back against the rough wood. The Winchester laid across his knees. He left the barn door cracked open just enough to see the faint line of lamplight under the cabin door. He would watch. He would listen. He was a man accustomed to vigils. Inside the cabin, the only light was the low, steady glow of the lamp. The fire in the hearth had died to embers, and the smoke from its earlier efforts drew lazy, rhythmic patterns on the low-beamed ceiling beside the cot. The zinc basin sat on the floor, the water within it a dark, still testament to the violence she had endured. Raven drifted in a fevered, twilight state, suspended between consciousness and the deep, dark pull of oblivion. Her dreams were a chaotic storm of fractured images. She saw fire, bright and hungry, consuming a lodge. She heard the thunder of hooves, the panicked shouts of men, the high, thin scream of a woman. She felt the bite of the rope, the sun's hateful fire on her skin, the terror of suffocating, of hanging in a void. But through the nightmare, a new sensation threaded itself, the feeling of rough, calloused hands, hands that were not striking, not binding, but washing. She dreamed of water, of coolness, of hands that moved with a strange, slow purpose, washing away the grit, the blood, and the fear. When the first pale, gray light of dawn crept through the window, Elias was already moving. He had not slept. He returned to the cabin, moving with the quiet footsteps of a man who lives alone. She was in the same position he had left her, but her breathing seemed a fraction deeper, the shivers less violent. The fever had not broken, but it had not worsened. That was something. He stirred the embers in the hearth, added fresh wood, and set a pot of coffee to boil. The smell filled the small room, rich and comforting. He took a skillet and put it on the stove, warming a thick portion of leftover beans he'd cooked 2 days prior. He sliced a piece of cornbread from a loaf and set it all on a tin plate. He poured a cup of coffee, cooling it with a splash of water from the barrel. He placed the plate and the cup on the small crate he used as a bedside table. "Food," he said, his voice flat. "You need to eat." He didn't know if she would, or could. He backed away, giving her space, and took his own coffee to the far table, sitting with his back to her. He drank, listening. For a long time, there was no sound but the crackle of the fire. Then, he heard a faint rustle of the blankets. A pause, the scrape of the tin plate on the crate. He heard the slow, hesitant sound of a spoon against the plate. He did not turn around. He kept his gaze fixed on the window, on the vast, empty expanse of desert outside, now painted in the soft hues of morning. He could feel her, though, He could feel her presence like a new, taut wire strung across the room. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Raven was sitting up, leaning heavily against the wall. The blanket was pooled around her waist. She was eating, but slowly, painfully, her bandaged hands trembling as she lifted the spoon. Her eyes were not on him. They were fixed on the window, on the open land beyond the glass. Her entire body was rigid, her back held as straight and tense as a bowstring. She looked exactly like what she was, a wild creature, cornered and wounded, whose every instinct was screaming for an escape it did not have the strength to make. 2 days passed in a fog of fever and strained silence. Elias moved with a quiet economy, tending to his few head of cattle in the pale hours of dawn and dusk. Never straying far from the cabin, he would return to find Raven exactly where he had left her, on the cot, her body rigid, her black eyes following his every move. He would leave broth and cooled coffee on the crate, and when he returned, the bowl and cup would be empty. She was healing. The raw, angry wounds on her wrists were slowly closing under his crude salves, and the deep, ugly bruises on her legs were fading from violent purple to a sickly yellow-green. But the silence in the cabin was as thick and heavy as a wool blanket soaked in water. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was a quiet of two animals trapped in the same small space, each waiting for the other to move first. He had not pressed her for her name again. Raven had settled around her, a name as dark and watchful as her gaze. On the morning of the third day, the air changed. The wind, which had been a steady, sighing presence from the south, died completely. The world held its breath. The screonk of the windmill ceased, and the silence that fell was absolute, unnatural. It was this lack of sound that woke Elias before dawn. He lay on his bedroll in the barn, his senses screaming. He rose, pulling on his boots in the pre-dawn chill. He did not go to the cabin. He went to the wash. His eyes scanned the damp, sandy ground near the small seep that passed for his well, and he found them. They were not the soft, scuffed prints of moccasins or the worn-down heels of a fellow rancher. These were sharp, precise, and identical. The heels were stamped with the telltale ring of new-forged nails. Cavalry. They had been close, scouting the water source. They hadn't come to the cabin, not yet, but they knew someone was here. The print was a promise, a threat pressed into his earth. Elias stood for a long minute, looking at the alien mark. The sign at the cottonwood tree had been an act of brutal anarchy. This boot print was its partner, cold, disciplined, and backed by government steel. He felt a slow, cold anger uncoil in his gut. He had wanted nothing to do with any of it, but the world had come knocking. He turned and walked back to the cabin, his face set in hard lines. He did not go inside. He checked the load in his Winchester, the brass cartridges gleaming dully in the gray light. He chambered around with a solid, definitive thack. Then he sat on the top step of his small porch, laid the rifle across his thighs, and waited. The sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in thin, bloody streaks. He watched the heat begin to shimmer off the distant mesa. He listened to the world slowly coming back to life, but his focus was narrow, aimed down the long, dusty track that was his only road. Behind him, inside the cabin, he heard a sound so faint it was almost imaginary, a bare foot on the wooden floor. He knew she was awake. He knew she was watching him. Raven had moved from the cot, her body still aching but her mind sharp with a familiar, cold dread. The unnatural silence had woken her, too. She crept to the cabin's single window, pulling the edge of the rough canvas curtain back just a fraction of an inch. She saw him, Elias, sitting on the porch, not with the slumped posture of a weary rancher, but with a ramrod stillness, a rifle held not in threat, but in readiness. He was watching the horizon. He was waiting, and she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach clench, that he was waiting for them. The men from the tree, or the men in blue. To her, they were the same. The silence stretched for an hour, Then 2. The sun was high enough to be hot, and the windmill still hadn't moved. Then Elias heard it, a faint, rhythmic vibration through the soles of his boots before his ears ever caught the sound. Hoofbeats. More than one. Coming steady. He didn't move. He just watched the heat haze shimmer, and slowly, 3 figures resolved themselves out of the glare. They were dark blue, bright yellow insignia flashing on their caps and sleeves. Cavalry. They rode at a measured, professional trot, kicking up a plume of dust that seemed to mock the thirsty land. Raven saw them, too. Her breath hitched, and she pressed her back flat against the log wall, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle any sound. She squeezed her eyes shut, seeing in her mind the red paint, the swinging rope. The riders pulled up 20 yards from the cabin. 2 enlisted men, their faces young and burned red by the sun, stayed back, their hands resting on their carbines. The man in the lead, an officer, dismounted. He was tall, with a precise, dark mustache and eyes that looked as tired as the land itself. He unhooked the flap of his holster but left the pistol inside. He walked toward the porch, his nailed heels crunching on the hardpan. "Morning," the officer said. His voice was educated, out of place. "Lieutenant Silas Dighton, Dust Vale Station." Elias said nothing. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The Winchester remained on his lap. Dighton stopped at the bottom step, his gaze sweeping over Elias. The cabin, the closed door, the silent windmill. "Quiet place you've got." "I like it quiet," Elias replied, his voice a low rasp. Dighton nodded, as if expecting this. He reached into his tunic pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a government circular. He unfolded it and held it up. "We're tracking a fugitive, part of a hostile band that's been causing trouble up near the territories. Thought you might have seen something." Elias looked at the paper. It was a crude charcoal sketch of a young woman, her features harsh and exaggerated. But the hair was right. The eyes were right. Beneath it, words were printed: dangerous, escaped, reward $50. $50. Enough to buy a good horse. Enough to keep a man in beans and whiskey for half a year. Enough to get a man killed. Elias shook his head, his gaze flat and empty. "Haven't seen anyone. Nothing out here but stubborn goats and dry wells." The lie was perfectly smooth, delivered with the casual disinterest of a man who truly had seen nothing. Lieutenant Dighton held his gaze for a long time, the paper fluttering slightly in his hand. His eyes flicked for just a second to the cabin door, behind which he surely heard the echo of his own voice. "That's a shame," Dighton said, folding the paper slowly. "Because we found a scene, back on Cinder Mesa, at the Cottonwood Grove. Looked like some local boys got overeager with their justice." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "They left a message." "That a fact?" Elias said. It wasn't a question. "They did." Dighton's voice hardened. "But I'll tell you, Merrick, as a courtesy, the girl on this paper, she's not some lost child. She's with a brutal band. They burn, they steal, they kill, they leave their mark. And the men who are really hunting her, not just me, but the ones who put her on that tree, they don't forgive." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. They don't forgive. The same words as the sign. Dighton wasn't just investigating a crime. He was explaining a policy. He was, in his own official way, justifying the rope. A coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air settled deep into Elias's bones. His grip on the rifle's wooden stock tightened until his knuckles were white. He looked past Dighton, at the 2 young soldiers, at the endless, empty land beyond them. "If I see her," Elias said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a growl, "I'll report it." It was a dismissal. Dighton recognized it as such. The rancher was not afraid of him, and he was not going to offer any more information. The officer's mask of professional courtesy tightened. He gave a single, curt nod. "See that you do. Marek, good day." He turned, his boots crunching, and swung back up onto his horse. The three riders wheeled their mounts as one and trotted away, their backs rigid, their blue uniforms a shrinking blot on the landscape. They disappeared back into the heat haze, and the only proof they had ever been there was a fresh set of hoofprints in the dust and a silence that felt heavier, more fragile than before. Raven was still pressed against the wall, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She had heard it all. Dangerous, hostile, $50. They don't forgive. She had heard the flat, final way Elias had dismissed him. She had heard his lie. Elias sat on the porch for a long time, watching the dust settle. The screonk of the windmill started up again, a hesitant, rusty complaint as the wind finally picked up from the north. He felt hollowed out, as if the officer had taken something from him. He stood, his joints stiff, and turned to the cabin. He pushed the door open. The interior was dark after the bright sun, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. She was there, standing in the farthest, darkest corner, by the cold hearth. She looked like a shadow, poised to flee, her bandaged wrists held close to her chest. He stopped just inside the doorway, leaving the open air at his back and giving her the whole of the room. He slowly, deliberately, reached up and pulled his hat from his head, holding it by the brim in both hands. It was a gesture of peace, of deference. She watched him, her eyes wide, unblinking. "They're looking for you," he said, stating the obvious. His voice was just a quiet rumble. "The soldier, he had a poster, said you were dangerous." She flinched, but said nothing. "He said they were offering $50. Her chin lifted, a tiny, defiant gesture. Elias looked down at the hat in his hands, then back at her. "He asked if I'd seen you. I said no." He said it simply, as a fact, not as a boast, not as a request for thanks. It was a confession. He had crossed the line. He was no longer just a man who had cut a rope. He was a man who had lied to the U.S. Cavalry. He was, in the eyes of the law, her accomplice. Raven's shoulders, which had been tensed so high they were almost touching her ears, lowered by a fraction. The rigid, animal terror in her posture softened, replaced by a profound, exhausted wariness. She still didn't trust him, but she no longer saw him as an immediate threat. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but it felt as significant as the moving of a mountain. A tiny fissure had opened in the wall of silence between them, and through it, a thin, hesitant trickle of trust began to flow. That night, the tension returned, but it was of a different kind. It was no longer the tension of hunter and prey, but of two fugitives sharing a small, dark space. Elias knew he couldn't sleep in the barn, not with cavalry scouting the wash. He brought his bedroll to the porch, giving her the cabin, but staying close enough to guard it. The sun went down, and the desert turned a deep, bruised indigo. The air grew cold. Elias sat on his bedroll, his back against the cabin's log wall. He could feel the faint warmth of the hearth fire through the wood. He could feel her presence on the other side of the wall, a few scant inches away. He was acutely aware of her every movement, real or imagined. The smallness of the cabin, the vulnerability of her healing body, the memory of her black eyes, it all churned in his mind. A dangerous, unwelcome distraction. He needed to focus. He needed to keep his mind hard. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath, the same knife that had cut her free, and took his whetstone from his saddlebag. He spat on the stone and began to sharpen the blade. Shing! 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 The sound was rhythmic, metallic, and sharp. It cut through the night, a counterpoint to the lonely cry of the windmill. He focused on the sound, on the feel of the steel gliding over the stone, on the precise angle of the edge. With every stroke, he tried to hone his own thoughts, to pare away the softness, the compassion, the growing, complicated feeling he had for the woman inside. The sound was a meditation. It was a barrier, It was the sound of a man trying to keep his mind from straying where it shouldn't. Inside, Raven heard the noise. Shing, shing, shing. At first, it sent a new jolt of fear through her. A knife, in the dark. But the sound wasn't frenzied. It was slow, steady, methodical. It was controlled. Her strength was returning. She stood from the cot, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. The cabin felt too small. A trap. She paced, a single line from the dark corner to the door, back and forth. She was a panther in a cage. The man who had lied for her was just outside. She found herself drawn to the door. She stopped, her head tilted, listening. The shing of the knife continued. A steady, scraping breath in the night. She moved closer, until her face was inches from the rough-hewn planks. She held her own breath. And then, beneath the sound of the steel, she heard it. The sound of his breathing. It was low and slow and steady. The sound of the man sitting on the other side of the wood, his back pressed against the same wall she was leaning on. It was not the ragged breath of an enemy. It was not the shallow gasp of a dying man. It was just a man, existing. The sound of the knife sharpening stopped. In the sudden, vast silence, there was only the wind in the distance and the faint, shared sound of two people breathing in the dark, separated by nothing but a single, thin wall of wood. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in days, did not see the rope. She just listened. The sun was a pale wafer in a dusty sky when Raven, for the first time, stepped voluntarily out of the cabin. The threshold had been a line she would not cross, a boundary between the dark, cramped safety of the cabin and the vast, dangerous emptiness of the world that had tried to kill her. Now, she stood on the packed earth porch, her bare feet shrinking from the cool ground. She was wrapped in a thick, woven wool blanket Elias had left on a chair, a trade blanket, patterned with bold stripes of red and dark blue. It felt impossibly heavy, a new kind of skin she could hide inside. The wind was relentless, sweeping the yard clean of any loose dirt, leaving it hard and scored. It whipped the hem of the blanket around her legs and pushed her matted black hair across her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sensations wash over her, the cold air on her cheeks, the scent of juniper and dried dust, the mournful, rhythmic screonk of the windmill. It was the sound of loneliness, but it was also the sound of life. It meant water. It meant this place was real. Elias watched from the shadows of the barn, where he was ostensibly mending a piece of harness. He had seen her hesitate in the doorway, a shadow framed by light, and his hands had gone still on the leather strap. He did not move, did not speak. He just watched. He had learned in his years of solitude that wild things, whether they were mustangs or wounded women, were best approached with stillness. Any sudden movement would send them fleeing back into the shadows. She stood on the porch for a long time, a solitary, blanket-wrapped figure, small against the immense, brutal landscape. Then, her movement stiff from days of stillness and pain. She descended the 2 steps. She walked into the center of the yard, her head tilted back, looking at the pale sky as if reacquainting herself with an old enemy. Her bandaged wrists were held close to her body, hidden in the folds of the wool. She stopped, her gaze dropping to the ground. She looked around, her eyes scanning, until she found what she was looking for, a thin, dry stick, broken from a tumbleweed. She bent, her body protesting the movement. With a low groan she quickly stifled and picked it up. Kneeling on the hard, wind-swept earth, she began to draw. Her movements were slow at first, hesitant. She scratched a circle in the dirt. Then she drew it again, deeper, her brow furrowed in concentration. Inside the circle, she began to trace other lines. They were angular and swift, suggesting wings, a tail, a sharp head. It was a bird, stylized and fierce, caught within the circle. But the circle was not a cage. She added sharp, jagged lines radiating from the circle's edge, both inward and outward. It was not just a circle. It was a ring of fire. She stared at the image, her lips moving silently. She seemed to have forgotten Elias, the cabin, the world. She was lost in the symbol, her finger now tracing the lines her stick had made. Elias felt he could move now. He left the harness in the barn and walked toward her, his boot heels making a soft, crunching sound on the ground. He did not want to startle her, but he could not stay away. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from her, close enough to be heard, far enough to be safe. He stood, his hat in his hands, his shadow falling long beside her. She did not look up, but her hand froze on the drawing. She knew he was there. "What is that?" Elias asked. His voice was quiet, respectful, not demanding. Raven did not move for a long moment. The wind whistled past them, kicking up a small dust devil near the sagging barn. When she finally spoke, her voice was a revelation. It was not the whisper or the gasp of a victim. It was hoarse. Yes, dry as the arroyo, but it was low and resonant, filled with a grit that matched the land itself. "It is my family sign," she said, her fingers still resting on the dirt bird. "Akete." "Akete," he repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "It means the bird in the fire." She finally turned her head, looking up at him. Her black eyes were clear, the fever haze gone, replaced by a deep, cold clarity. "My people say we fly because of the fire, not from it." She looked back at the drawing, and the dam of silence that had held for 3 days finally, catastrophically, broke. The story did not come out gently. It spilled from her, a torrent of sharp, broken facts, like stones rattling down a dry wash. "They came with paper," she said, her voice growing stronger, fueled by the memory. "The soldiers, like your Lieutenant Dayton, they said the land was no longer ours, that we must move to the reservation at San Carlos, a poison place, a place to die." She spat on the ground. "Our shaman said no. This is our land. The bones of our mothers are in this earth. The deer know our prayers. We do not leave." Elias stood motionless, the hat crushed in his hands. He knew this story. He had heard variations of it whispered in saloons, boasted about by freight drivers. He had just never stood this close to the wreckage. "They gave us 1 moon. We did not move. So they came back, not just the blue-coat soldiers. They came with the local men, the ones from the mining camps, the ones who don't forgive." She spoke the words like a curse. "They came at dawn. They brought the fire." Her gaze became distant, her eyes seeing the yard at Dry Lantern Wash, but her mind seeing a different place, a place of smoke and screams. The lodges burned. The canvas, it melts like animal fat. The smoke was thick. I ran. Her voice caught, but she pushed on. A terrible need to bear witness. My mother, she would not leave her lodge. I tried to pull her. She was holding her prayer beads, the blue ones. She just sat and looked at me. The roof fell. A single, hard tear carved a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "My brothers, they took up the old rifles. They were boys. They lay in the ashes. Their hair was gone. From the heat." "My father, here." Her voice broke completely. She took a ragged, shuddering breath and clenched her hand in the dirt, crushing the drawing of the bird. "They took him to the meeting post, the big cottonwood where we hold council. They hanged him there, for all to see, as a lesson." Elias's hands tightened on his hat, his knuckles turning stark white. He felt a familiar, cold sickness rising in his throat, a suffocating, old anger. "They found me," she continued, her voice flat now. All emotion burned out of it. "I was hiding in the creek bed. They pulled me out by my hair. They struck me. They said I stole a gun. They said I was one of the hostiles." She laughed, a short, ugly, broken sound. "They dragged me to the mesa, to another tree. They tied me up. They said I was bait. that any others who were still alive would come for me, and they would be waiting. She looked up at him, her eyes burning into his. They were right. You came. Elias felt as if he had been struck, the casual, monstrous cruelty of it to use her broken body as a lure. He looked at her bandaged wrists, at the faint, fading bruises on her face. He saw the red-painted sign, the smug, hateful words, and in that moment, his own carefully constructed wall of solitude, the grief he had nursed in silence for a decade, shattered. "Fire!" he said, the word choked, torn from his own throat. He knelt in the dirt across from her, not as a gesture of comfort, but because his legs would no longer hold him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ground, at the ruined drawing of the bird. I know that smell," he whispered. And now it was his turn to confess. The words pulled from a place he had kept locked and buried for 10 years. "I had a sister," he said, his voice as rough as hers. "Sarah, she was just a girl, 14. He stared at his own calloused, empty hands. "We had a barn fire, back east, a lantern tipped. The hay had went up like gunpowder." He was back there, a boy of 19, smelling the sweet, terrible scent of burning hay and panicked horses. "She was in the loft. She was afraid of the ladder. I was outside. I was pulling the horses clear. I heard her screaming my name. Elias, Elias." He closed his eyes, his face contorted in a mask of ancient pain. "I ran to the barn door. The heat it was like a solid wall, like a hand that pushed me back. The smoke, I couldn't breathe. I could hear her, and I was afraid." The confession hung in the air, a terrible, shameful secret. "I was afraid of the fire. I stood there. I just stood there. For a second, maybe 2, I told myself I was waiting for a breath, for the smoke to clear, but I was just afraid. And then I was too late. By the time I went in, the loft was gone. And she—" He couldn't finish. He opened his clenched fists. They were shaking. "I lost her. I failed her. I was slow. I was a coward." He had never spoken those words aloud to another living soul. He had carried them, a cold, heavy stone in his gut, all the way to New Mexico, to this empty wash, where he could punish himself with silence and hard labor for the rest of his life. Raven watched him, her own grief momentarily eclipsed by the raw, naked pain of this man, this Nantan who had saved her, who had washed her feet and bandaged her wounds, had his own ghosts. He, too, knew the smell of ash and the sound of a life ending. The silence that fell was no longer empty. It was filled with their shared, terrible knowledge. The wind sighed around them, a mournful chorus. Finally, Raven spoke. Her voice was soft now, all the grit gone. She asked the one question that lay at the heart of everything, the question that had been burning in her mind since she first saw his white face leaning over her. "If I was a white woman," she asked, her gaze unwavering, "would you have cut the rope?" The question was a knife, aimed directly at the center of him. It demanded a truth beyond his guilt, beyond her pain. Was his act one of humanity, or one of pity? Was it redemption for Sarah, or something else? Elias looked up from the dirt, his faded blue eyes meeting her dark ones. He saw her question, and he saw the lifetime of pain behind it. He saw the expectation of a lie, or a deflection, or a pretty, meaningless word. He had no such words to give. He had only the truth, a truth he was only just discovering himself. He reached out, his hand shaking, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. His calloused, rough hand, stained with dirt and leather oil, came to her face. She flinched, a lifetime of instinct making her recoil from a raised hand. But he did not strike. He did not grab. His fingers were surprisingly gentle. He cupped her chin, his thumb resting on the line of her jaw. He leaned closer, his eyes holding hers, forcing her to see the truth in them. "I don't love the skin," he said, his voice a low, rough vow. "I love the breath beneath it." He saw the shock in her eyes, the sudden, sharp intake of her breath. He had answered the unanswerable. And in that moment, the space between them vanished. It was not a calculated decision. It was a gravitational pull. Two survivors clinging to the only other piece of wreckage in a vast, burning ocean. He leaned in, and she did not pull away. Their lips met. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, desperate recognition. It was small, hesitant, trembling. Her lips were chapped and dry, and his were rough. It was the taste of dust and salt and old sorrow. It was a question and an answer, all at once. Then something shifted. Her hand, the one that wasn't lost in the dirt, came up and rested on his bandaged wrist. His hand tightened on her jaw, just barely, holding her steady. The kiss, which had been a simple, trembling touch, deepened. It became a conscious act, a sharing of breath. It was like two people who had been suffocating, she on a rope. He on his guilt suddenly, miraculously, remembering how to breathe. It was a promise, not of a future, but of the present. A promise that, for this 1 second, they were both, impossibly, alive. That kiss, small and trembling as it was, had broken something open. The silence that followed was different, no longer a weapon or a shield, but a space they now shared. The confession of their separate, fiery traumas had forged a link, a brittle and scarred thing, but a link nonetheless. The next 3 days were a strange dream, a fragile truce with the world that hunted them. Life settled into a rhythm that was part a underscore lie and part a prayer. They were two people pretending at a life they could not have. Elias rose before dawn, as he always did, and made coffee. He would set a mug on the table for her, and when he returned from checking his meager livestock, it would be empty. He found her, on the first of these 3 days, standing awkwardly by the sagging barn, the striped wool blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. He had stopped, not wanting to spook her. "The mule," he said, gesturing with his chin. "She needs her stall mucked out, if you're feeling up to it." It was a test, a way to offer her purpose beyond that of a patient. She looked at the barn, then at him, her dark eyes assessing, then, with a single, curt nod. She dropped the blanket on a fence rail and walked into the barn. He had watched her for a moment. Her movements were stiff. Her bandaged wrists clearly pained her, but she worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. She was strong, stronger than he knew. So they worked. He took his tools and rode the short line of his property, mending the barbed wire where the desert had tried to reclaim it. The twing of the wire stretcher and the thud of the post hammer were his words. She, in turn, claimed the cabin and the immediate yard. She swept the floor until it was clean, aired out the musty bed linens, and even made a passable attempt at organizing his cluttered shelves. They were two solitary people, suddenly and awkwardly orbiting one another. They rarely spoke. Words, they had both learned, were dangerous. They were for confessions and accusations. Silence was for work, but their shared space was full of a new, quiet language. The way he left a clean rag and fresh salve by the water basin. The way she had a pot of hot, bitter coffee waiting when she heard his horse returning at midday. On the second day, the moment happened. Elias was refilling the water trough for his cantankerous mule. Jezebel. Raven was shaking a dusty rug on the porch. The mule, impatient, nudged Elias hard in the back, looking for the grain she knew he had. "Hold your horses, you old sinner," Elias grumbled, pushing the mule's head away. Jezebel, offended by the rejection, pinned her ears back and let fly with both back legs. She didn't connect with him, but her hooves struck the metal feed trough with a resounding clang that sent it spinning into the air. It landed upside down in the dust, the carefully portioned oats scattering like buckshot. Elias stood, hands on hips, and stared at the mess. "Well," he said to the mule, who was already pretending nothing had happened, "I hope you're proud of yourself." From the porch, he heard a sound. It was not a laugh, not really. It was a short, sharp bark of sound, choked off the instant it was born. He turned. Raven was standing there, one hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Her eyes, above her hand, were crinkling at the corners. She was laughing, or trying to. Elias felt a strange, unfamiliar tug at the corners of his own mouth. A slow smile spread across his face, cracking the dry mask of his solitude. He let out a short, rough chuckle. "Ornery beast," he said. Their eyes met across the yard. The shared, startled moment of humor, of simple, mundane life, was more intimate than the kiss. It was a glimpse of what could be, in a world that wasn't trying to tear them apart. The smile faded from her face, and she quickly turned back inside. But the ice was broken. The third day, at high noon, the world returned. Elias was on the porch, reseating the worn handle of a hammer. When he heard the hoofbeats, it was not the disciplined, rhythmic approach of the cavalry. This was sloppier, more arrogant. 3 riders, coming too fast, kicking up an unnecessary plume of yellow dust. He stood slowly, the hammer in his hand, and watched them come. The man in the lead was broad and heavy, with a florid face and a thick, drooping mustache. A dented tin star was pinned crookedly to his filthy vest. This was Judd Kearney, the self-appointed law of Blue Willow Crossing, a 20-mile distant collection of tents and false-fronted saloons that had sprung up around a failed silver mine. Kearney was a bully who had found that a badge, even a fake one, gave his bullying the thin veneer of authority. The 2 men behind him were shadows, gaunt and watchful, their hands already resting on the pistol grips at their hips. Kearney reined in his horse so hard it skittered, spraying dust over the porch steps. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Elias's boot. "Merrick!" Kearney boomed, not as a greeting, but as an accusation. "Kearney," Elias replied, his voice flat. The hammer felt heavy and solid in his hand. Kearney's small, piggish eyes swept the homestead. He noted the clean-swept yard, the mended harness on the rail, the faint scent of wood smoke from the chimney. Places looking tended. "I manage," Elias said. Kearney leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on his saddle horn. His smile was a greasy sneer. "Word is, you're managing more than cattle these days. Merrick, word is you've got yourself some company." He jerked his head toward the cabin. "Heard you're harboring an Apache girl." Elias didn't blink. He watched a bead of sweat trace a line through the grime on Kearney's neck. "Heard lots of things," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Heard you were a U.S. Marshal. Heard it rained gold up at your crossing. Lots of things get heard. Doesn't make 'em true." The sneer on Kearney's face tightened. The 2 men behind him shifted, their fingers flexing. "Don't you get smart with me, you hermit," Kearney snarled. "We found a situation up on Cinder Mesa. Some local boys left a prize, and then some blue-belly lieutenant comes sniffing around. Says the prize is gone. Says he tracked a shod horse from there to this wash. He was here," Elias said. "He left." "But she didn't." Kearney's eyes locked on the cabin door. "I'm guessing she's in there. The one on the poster. $50 girl. I'm here to collect her. And you for aiding a fugitive." "Is that so?" Elias said it wasn't a question. "I'm coming in, Merrick." Kearney started to swing his leg over the saddle. "You got a warrant?" Elias asked. Kearney froze, 1 foot out of the stirrup. He stared at Elias as if he'd just sprouted a second head, and then he laughed, a loud, barking sound that was nothing like the shared laugh over the mule. "A warrant," he roared. "You hear this, boys? He wants paper." He swung his leg back, settling into the saddle, and his hand dropped to his own holster. "This ain't a courthouse, Merrick. This is New Mexico. And this," he patted the butt of his pistol, "is my warrant." The air turned to glass. It was so quiet Elias could hear the creak of Kearney's saddle leather, The buzz of a fly near the water trough. The wind died. The windmill fell silent. The two gunslingers behind Kearney had not moved, but their intent was a palpable thing, a physical pressure in the air. Elias did not move. He did not look at his rifle, which was just inside the door. He simply stood, the hammer held loosely in his right hand, his eyes locked on Kearney. He was a rock, a piece of the mesa, and he would not be moved. Inside the cabin, Raven stood in the deepest shadow, pressed against the log wall, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She held Elias's heavy skinning knife, the one he used for butchering. Her hand was shaking, but her grip was tight. She had heard every word. She was $50. She was a prize. She was an Apache. She was not a person. She was a thing to be collected. Kearney stared at Elias, who stared back with those dead, empty blue eyes. Kearney was a bully, and the first rule of bullying is to never push a man who isn't afraid of you. He saw no fear in Elias Merrick. He saw only a deep, cold well of something he didn't want to fall into. "You're a fool, Merrick," Kearney spat, pulling his horse's head around. "You're harboring vermin, and you're protecting property that belongs to the men who found her." He backed his horse up a few steps, his men moving with him. "This ain't over," Kearney vowed, his face red with frustration. "I'll be back, and I'll have more men, enough men to burn this whole damn wash to the ground with you in it. You think on that?" He wheeled his horse and spurred it, the three of them galloping away in the same cloud of angry dust they had arrived in. Elias stood on the porch until the dust was just a smudge on the horizon. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The hammer was suddenly heavy. He tossed it onto the porch. He turned and pushed open the cabin door. She was there, in the shadows, the big knife in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a cold fire. She didn't put the knife down. "He'll be back," she said. It was the first thing she had said to him all day. "I know," Elias said. He walked past her to the water bucket and drank a dipper of water, his hand shaking slightly. The fragile peace was shattered. The pretense of a life was over. They were back to what they had been, two fugitives, hunted. That night, a different kind of ritual took place. The sun had long set, and a sliver of moon gave the world a ghostly, silver-blue light. Elias took a shovel from the barn. Raven watched him from the cabin doorway. He walked to a spot behind the sagging barn, a place where the earth was already disturbed. He began to dig. It didn't take long. He unearthed the splintered plank of wood he had buried there 3 days ago, the one he had pulled from the cottonwood tree. He carried it back to the center of the yard, to the small, stone-ringed fire pit they used for cooking. He laid it flat. "White men don't forgive." The red-painted letters seemed to glow in the moonlight, slick and wet-looking. He took his hatchet from his belt and, with a few short, violent blows, splintered the plank into smaller pieces. He laid them in the fire pit, added kindling, and struck a match. The fire caught, the dry wood crackling. Raven came out of the cabin, drawn to the light. She walked to him, not stopping a few feet away, but coming to stand right beside him, so close their shoulders brushed. They stood together, two dark figures against the bright, growing flames, and watched the sign burn. The paint bubbled and blackened. The wood curled. The hateful letters, one by one, corrupted, shriveled, and turned to gray ash. The word "forgive" was the last to go, twisting into an unrecognizable black scar before collapsing into embers. The wind, which had been still and tense all evening, suddenly picked up, a soft, cool breeze from the south. It fanned the embers, making them glow a furious, bright red, and then it carried the fine, gray ash of the sign up into the dark sky, scattering it into nothing. The air felt cleaner. The night, suddenly, seemed softer. Raven's hand, the one that wasn't holding the borrowed knife, reached out. She didn't take his hand. She gripped the rough canvas of his shirt, just above his waist, her fingers bunching the material. It was a desperate, grounding grip. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. Elias did not look at her. He just stared into the fire. He knew she wasn't just thanking him for burning the sign. She was thanking him for lying to the cavalry, for facing down Kearney, for the water, the salve, the shared, stolen laugh, for cutting the rope. He covered her hand with his own, his large, calloused palm pressing her fingers flat against his side. "Time to go," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I know," she whispered back. They both understood. This fire was not a victory. It was a funeral pyre. It was a farewell to this place, to the brief, impossible dream of peace. Kearney would be back, and when he came, he would bring a fire of his own. They had to be gone before then. They left the embers to die and went back into the cabin. The atmosphere was charged, urgent. The time for silence and slow orbits was over. Elias lit the lantern and spread his most valued possession on the rough table, a hand-drawn map, sketched on a piece of tanned deer hide. It showed the ridges, washes, and water holes for 100 miles south. He began to pack, his movements swift and economical. He laid out a canvas sheet. On it, he piled hardtack biscuits, a long, dark sausage of dried beef, a full twist of salt. He went to his small medicine tin and took out a roll of clean linen bandages, a spool of thick thread with a needle stuck in it, and a small, dark blue glass vial with a cork stopper. The vial was full. Laudanum for pain. Raven watched him, then began to move herself. She took her own small pouch and added the leftover salve. She filled both of his canteens from the water barrel. She found his spare ammunition box and slipped cartridges into the loops of his gun belt. They worked without speaking, a practiced, efficient team. Elias laid the full canvas sheet flat and expertly rolled it into a tight bedroll, tying it with leather thongs. He took one last look at his map. His finger, blunt and scarred, traced a line south, through a series of jagged, angry lines he had drawn to represent mountains. He tapped a single spot, a narrow gap in the ridges. Madrone Pass, the escape route, their only chance. The dawn came not as a promise, but as a judgment. The wind, which had been their constant, whispering companion, died completely. The air at Dry Lantern Wash became utterly still, heavy and cold. The blades of the windmill were motionless, pointing like a silent accusation at the pale, greenish sky. "Bad sign," Elias murmured, his voice a low rasp in the pre-dawn gloom. He cinched the strap on his saddle, his movements precise and economical. He was saddling Dusty, his own gelding, and the smaller, wiry bay mare he kept as a spare. Raven, already wrapped in his long duster coat over her own clothes, was strapping the tightly rolled canvas bedroll and saddlebags onto the mare. Her bandaged wrists were awkward, but her fingers were deft, her knots tight. She worked without a word, her face a pale, grim mask in the half-light. She had braided her hair into 2 tight plaits, not for beauty, but for practicality. She looked like a warrior, not a victim. They left the cabin as it was. The coffee pot was still on the cold stove. The tin plates were on the table. Elias paused at the door, looking back into the small, dark room that had been his entire world. It had been a fortress of solitude. In 5 short days, it had become a refuge, a prison, and now, a memory. He pulled the door shut, but didn't latch it. It settled against the frame with a soft thud, leaving a small gap, as if it were an eye half closed, already starting to forget them. They mounted in silence. Elias led the way, not down the main track, but straight up the back of the arroyo, onto the hard, rocky ground of the high mesa. The plan was to reach Sable Ridge by moonrise, a jagged spine of black rock that offered 1,000 places to hide and 1,000 places to be ambushed. From there, they would follow it south, staying off the flatlands where their dust would be a beacon for miles. They rode all day, a grueling, silent trek under the oppressive sun. The landscape itself felt like a pursuer, It offered them no shade, no comfort. The rocks were sharp, threatening to lame the horses. The slopes were treacherous, covered in loose scree that slid and rattled under the horses' hooves. Each sound an agony of betrayal. They spoke only in short, clipped phrases. Water. Wait. This way. Elias was a master of this terrain, and Raven, he quickly learned, was his equal. She rode with a natural, easy grace, her body moving with the mare's, her eyes constantly scanning not the horizon, as he did, but the ground, the rocks, the air just above the brush, as if reading a language he only partially understood. By the time the sun bled out in the west, they were high on Sable Ridge. The world below them was a vast, darkening ocean of purple shadow. A late, waning moon, thin and curved as a sickle, rose in the east, casting a ghostly, treacherous light. The rocks turned silver and black, and the shadows became bottomless pits. "We keep moving," Elias said, his voice raw with fatigue. "They'll expect us to make camp. We ride till moonset." Raven just nodded, her face obscured by the brim of the hat he had given her. They pushed on, the horses stumbling with weariness. The night was cold, the silence absolute, broken only by the clack-clack of hooves on stone. It was in this vast, lunar silence that Elias's senses, honed by years of solitude, screamed a warning. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure change, a flicker of movement at the very edge of his vision. He reined in Dusty, his hand flying up in a signal to stop. "Get!" The word was stolen from his mouth by a deafening crack. A flash of orange fire bloomed on the ridge above them, 100 yards away. The sound of the shot and the impact were almost simultaneous. Elias felt a monstrous, invisible fist punch him in the side. The force was so great it lifted him from the saddle. He didn't feel pain, only a sudden, shocking numbness and the cold air rushing into his side. He heard Raven scream his name. It sounded very far away. He fell from the saddle like a sack of grain, landing hard on the rocky ground. The impact knocked the air from his lungs in a pained grunt. He lay on his back, staring up at the sickle moon, which seemed to be spinning. Then the pain came, a white-hot, searing agony that spread from his ribs, stealing his breath. He tried to move, to draw his pistol, but his arm wouldn't obey. "Elias!" She was off her horse, a shadow kneeling beside him. Crack, another shot. The bullet sparked off a boulder inches from her head, whining off into the night. They were pinned down. They were targets. "Go!" Elias gasped, his hand fumbling for her arm. He tasted copper, blood. "Go, Raven, leave me! Run!" She stared at him, her face a pale oval in the moonlight. He could see the flash of her eyes, the fury. "No!" The word was a guttural snarl, an absolute, non-negotiable rejection of his command. Ping! Another bullet ricocheted. Closer this time. Shouts echoed from the ridge above, the voices Kearney's Dayton's distorted by the wind and the rocks. Raven grabbed the front of his duster. "Get up!" she screamed. "I can't," he wheezed. The world was going gray at the edges. "You will." She didn't try to lift him. She put her shoulder under his armpit and dragged. The rocks tore at his back, and a wave of pure, black agony ripped through him, making him cry out. She ignored it. She was impossibly strong, fueled by a terrifying, primal panic. She dragged him, half running, half crouching, toward a dark slash in the cliff face he had noted earlier. A deep, narrow crevice, barely visible. Bullets peppered the rocks around them. Thwack! Zip! Whine! The shooters were firing at shadows, their high-perched position making a direct shot into the dark cleft impossible. They were hooting and hollering, the sounds of men who believed they had their quarry cornered, but they did not follow. To enter that narrow, dark gap on foot would be suicide, a perfect funnel for an ambush. They would wait for morning. Raven hauled Elias into the blackness. The crevice was no more than 4 feet wide. He collapsed against the wall. sliding down into a sitting position. His breathing was a wet, shallow, bubbling sound that terrified him. "The horses," he managed to say.
"Gone,"
she said, her voice trembling.
"They bolted. It doesn't matter."
She fumbled in the dark, her hands finding his side. They came away sticky and hot. He heard her sharp, indrawn breath. "It's bad," he whispered. "Be quiet." Her voice was rough, commanding. She was all business. In the absolute dark, her hands became his doctor. She ripped his shirt open, her fingers probing the wound with a clinical lack of gentleness. He hissed in pain.
"It's through,"
she said, her voice shaking but steady.
"Through the side. Missed the gut, I think, but the blood."
She ripped a long strip from his torn shirt. She found his saddlebag, which she had managed to grab from his horse before it fled. Her hands searched inside, finding the medicine tin. She pulled out the vial of laudanum, the bandages, and a small pouch, gunpowder.
"This will hurt,"
she said. It was not an apology, it was a fact. "Do it." She didn't have a tourniquet. She took off her own leather belt, wrapped it tight around his chest, above the wound, cinching it with a grunt, trying to slow the bleeding. Then she uncorked the powder pouch with her teeth. She poured a small, stinging pile of the black powder directly into the wound. Elias screamed, a raw, strangled sound that was half swallowed by the rock walls. His whole body arched in a spasm of unbelievable pain. "Hold him," she said, though there was no one else to hear. She was talking to herself. She took the small, flat-packed flint and steel from his kit. She struck it. A tiny spark flared. She struck it again, leaning close. Her face illuminated for a fraction of a second, a mask of terrible concentration. The spark caught the powder. There was a bright, sizzling thump. The smell of sulfur and cooked meat filled the air. Elias's scream was cut off as he passed out from the pain. The crude, brutal cauterization had sealed the worst of the bleeding. When he came to, he was moving. She was dragging him again, deeper into the crevice. The passage twisted and turned, opening slightly into a small, sheltered alcove. It was barely a room, 10 feet square, but it was protected from the wind. And he could hear, ominously, the sound of a distant, roaring wind, like a waterfall. "Where?" he slurred. "The cleft ends," she panted, her voice echoing strangely. "It's a ledge, a sheer drop. They can't come from behind." She eased him down onto the canvas bedroll she had spread out. She was shaking, her work done, the adrenaline fading. He was shivering violently, the shock and blood loss draining all the heat from his body. She worked quickly, using the sparse madrone branches that grew in the cleft, leaning them against the rock wall and draping his duster coat over them to create a tiny, three-sided lean-to, cutting the draft. It was a crude, desperate shelter. She finished and knelt beside him, tucking the edges of the bedroll around his body. He was cold as stone. His eyes were half open, his vision blurred. He could see her face, a pale shape in the profound darkness of the cleft. "Cold," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "So cold." She lay down beside him on the narrow canvas, pressing her body against his, trying to give him her warmth. She pulled the last remaining blanket over both of them. He could feel the frantic rabbit heartbeat in her chest, or maybe it was his own. He was drifting, the edges of his mind fogging over. He felt the pull of the blackness, the cold, empty peace that was waiting for him. It felt like giving up. It felt like the barn fire, the moment of hesitation, the failure. He was failing again. "Raven," he breathed, his voice a thread, a dry rustle of leaves. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice fierce, close to his ear. If you were my wife," he slurred, his mind wandering. You'd call me back, every time I wanted to give up." He felt her body stiffen. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her face hovering inches from his in the dark. He could feel her breath, warm and quick on his cold cheek.
I am calling,
she said, her voice raw, intense, shaking with a fury that was aimed at the world, at the men on the ridge, at the death that was trying to steal him. She pressed her forehead against his, a hard, grounding contact, skin to skin, life to life.
I am calling, Elias,
she whispered, her voice breaking.
Don't you go, don't you dare.
Outside their small, dark sanctuary, the wind, which had been still, suddenly changed direction. A cold front from the north swept down the ridge. It howled over the opening of their cleft, masking any sound from within. And on the ridge above, it carried the frustrated shouts of their pursuers away, scattering their plans. They heard, faintly, the sound of horses, the jingle of harness. The men were moving. They were riding off, perhaps believing Elias was dead or mortally wounded, that the desert would finish the job. They were giving up the search for the night. The sounds faded, replaced by the howl of the shifting wind. The cleft in the rock fell silent, holding its secret. There was only the darkness, the cold, and the sound of two people breathing, one ragged and shallow, the other fierce and steady, locked together in a desperate, shared fight for one life. The first night in the cleft was a descent into a cold, fevered hell. The second was a slow climb back. By the third dawn, Elias knew he was not going to die. The fire from the gunpowder cauterization had done its brutal work, and the searing pain had subsided into a deep, throbbing ache that was a constant, grim reminder of his own mortality. But he was breathing. The wet, bubbling sound in his chest was gone, replaced by a respiration that was still shallow, but at least it was clear. Aliqua, he still thought of her as Raven. The name a hard shell around the truth of her had been a relentless, tireless guardian. She had ventured out into the gray light of the first morning, returning with her hands full of broad, waxy leaves he didn't recognize, which she chewed into a poultice and applied to his wound to draw out the fever. She had found their horses, patiently waiting in a box canyon a mile down the ridge, and had brought them to a hidden spring she'd located, a trickle of life seeping from the base of the cliff. It was this spring that saved them. It was a place the world had forgotten, a small, hidden bowl of green in the middle of a universe of dead rock. Cottonwoods, young and slender, grew by the water, and the air was cool and damp. It was here, on a patch of soft, sandy earth beside the murmuring water, that she made their camp. It was no more than a lean-to, his heavy duster and their shared canvas bedroll draped over a framework of fallen branches. But after the cold, hard rock of the crevice, it felt like a palace. For 2 more days, he did little more than drift in and out of a painful sleep. He was aware of her constant, quiet presence. He felt the cool, damp cloth she laid on his forehead. He tasted the thin, bitter broth she made by boiling herbs and a small piece of dried beef. He heard her whispering to the horses, her voice a low, soothing murmur. He was a patient, and she was the world. On the 5th night after the shooting, he was awake, truly awake. He was propped up against their rolled-up blankets, the throbbing in his side a manageable beast now. The moon was nearly full, and its light filtered through the thin canvas of their shelter, weaving threads of silver into the darkness. Outside, the small creek whispered over stones, a sound of constant, gentle life. Aliqua was kneeling beside him, dipping a rag into a wooden bowl of cool water. She wrung it out and reached to wipe the sweat from his brow. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her face in the filtered moonlight a study in tired, fierce concentration. The raw, angry wounds on her own wrists were healing, scabbed over now, a permanent, ropey scar branding her skin. He caught her hand before the rag could touch his face. His grip was weak, but it was enough. She froze, her black eyes locking with his. "You're still bossing the patient around," he rasped, the words scratching his dry throat. He tried for a smile. It was a weak, crooked thing, but it was real. A change happened in her face. The hard lines of concentration softened. The constant, watchful tension in her jaw eased. And then, for the first time since that brief, startled laugh over the mule, she smiled. It was not a big smile. It was a small, hesitant curve of her lips, a rare and precious thing that lit her face from within. It made her look impossibly young. "The patient is stubborn," she said, her voice a low murmur. "He needs a firm hand." She gently pulled her hand free and wiped his forehead. The cool cloth was a relief. When she was done, she didn't move away. She stayed kneeling beside him, and her hand, the one that had held the cloth, came to rest on his chest, flat over his heart. She closed her eyes, as if she were listening not with her ears, but with her palm, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his life beneath her hand. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet intimacy that it stole his breath. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the whisper of the creek and the slow, steady drum of his heart under her palm. He had been calling her Raven for days, in his fevered thoughts and in the few, rasped words he'd managed. But the name felt wrong now. It was his name for her, not hers. It was a name for a dark, hunted thing. The woman beside him, with her rare smile and her healing hands, was something more. "Tell me the truth," he whispered into the quiet. "Your real name." Her eyes opened. She looked at him, her gaze deep and searching. He had shared his deepest shame with her. Now he was asking for her deepest truth. She did not speak. Instead, she took his hand, the one that had cut the rope, the one that had held her chin in the dirt yard, and guided it. She moved his hand from her shoulder, across the space between them, and pressed his palm flat against her own chest, over her heart. She held it there, her hand over his, trapping him in a circle of warmth and life. He could feel the steady, strong beat of her heart against his own skin. "Alaqua," she whispered. The name was a breath, a secret shared in the silver dark. "It means still water." Elias closed his eyes. Alaqua. The name flowed over him, cool and clear, washing away the dust and the blood and the fire. Raven was a bird of ill omen, a creature of the night. Alaqua was peace, a deep, quiet pool in the middle of the desert, a place to rest, a place to heal. He let the name settle into the deepest part of him, a prayer he hadn't known he needed to say. When he opened his eyes, the warmth he felt was not just from her hand, it was in his own chest, a slow, spreading glow. He looked at her, and he did not see a fugitive or a victim. He saw Alaqua. He slowly pulled his hand away, and she let him. He shifted, hissing as a fresh wave of pain shot through his side, and managed to sit up straighter. She moved to sit beside him, her back against the same rolled blankets, their shoulders touching. They sat in a silence that was no longer empty, but full of unspoken things, of shared pain and a new, fragile hope. Their breaths fell into the same rhythm, a quiet harmony with the murmuring creek outside. The world, for a few precious moments, consisted only of the small, safe space within their shelter. He did not know who moved first. Perhaps it was the simple, magnetic pull of two people who had been through the fire together and found themselves, impossibly, on the other side. She turned her head, and he turned his, in the dim silvered light. Her face was a landscape of shadows and soft curves. He saw the strength in her jaw, the sorrow in her eyes, and a vulnerability that called to something deep within him. Alaqua lifted her hand, not to his face, but to the back of his neck. Her fingers were cool against his skin. She leaned in, her eyes never leaving his, and gently, deliberately, pulled him toward her. She initiated the kiss. It was nothing like the first one. That had been a kiss of desperation, of shared grief. This was a kiss of conscious choice. It was slow and deep and searching. She breathed him in, and he tasted the faint, bitter herbs from the broth she had made. a taste of his own healing. He, in turn, inhaled her scent, the clean smell of the creek water she had washed in, mingled with the faint, ever-present perfume of wood smoke that clung to her hair. His hand, the one that wasn't braced against the ground, came up to her back. He laid it flat between her shoulder blades, over the rough, worn fabric of her dress. He could feel the warmth of her skin through the cloth, the delicate strength of her spine. His fingers spread, a gesture not of possession, but of reverence, of support. He was holding something precious. The kiss deepened. Their breathing quickened, no longer in a shared, peaceful rhythm, but in a ragged, urgent duet. She broke the kiss, but only to press her forehead against his. Her eyes closed. He could feel her eyelashes flutter against his cheek. Their chests were pressed together, his hard and unyielding, hers soft. The frantic beat of her heart, a wild bird against his ribs. It was a language without words, a language of finding shelter, of seeking comfort, of profound, unspoken agreement. He felt a tremor run through her, a fine, violent shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She was afraid, but she was not pulling away. She was leaning into him, seeking his warmth, his solidity. She turned her face, her lips brushing against his ear. Her whisper was a raw, trembling breath against his skin. "Make me warm," she breathed. "Don't stop." The words were a plea, a command, a surrender. It was not a request for passion, but for life, for a heat that could chase away the bone-deep cold of the rope, of the fire, of the men who hunted them. Elias responded not with passion, but with a fierce, protective tenderness. He reached for his heavy, fleece-lined coat, the one he had first covered her with at the cottonwood tree. With his good arm, he wrapped it around her, pulling her tight against his side. He drew her into the circle of his warmth, enveloping her completely. He was not taking, he was giving. He was building a fortress of his own body around her. He held her like that, just holding her, his chin resting on the top of her head. He kissed her again, not on the lips, but on her temple, a soft, lingering press. He kissed her cheekbone, the line of her jaw, the soft, vulnerable place behind her ear. His fingers found hers, and their hands interlaced, a tight, desperate knot of flesh and bone. This was not a fire that consumed. It was a fire in a hearth, a fire that promised to keep the wolves and the winter at bay. It was a fierce, desperate, and profoundly respectful claiming, not of her body, but of her safety. Outside, the creek murmured its endless, soothing song. Inside the small, canvas-walled world, there were only the sounds of their breathing and the counterpoint of their two hearts, beating as one. It was a silent promise, made in the moonlight, a vow that as long as they were together, they would not be cold. They would not be alone. Eventually, the tension drained from her body. The shivers subsided. She went limp in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder, her breathing slowing, deepening. He held her until he felt the steady, even rhythm of sleep in her breath. He leaned back against the blankets, his own body screaming with a dull, throbbing pain, but it was a distant pain now. He looked down at her, her face peaceful in sleep, her hand still locked with his. The warmth from her body was seeping into him, a healing balm more potent than any medicine. For the first time since the bullet had torn through his side, Elias Merrick closed his eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless, healing sleep. Aliqua, however, did not sleep the night away. An hour before dawn, she woke. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and steady, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen. She did not move from his arms. She just shifted, turning into her role as the guardian, the watcher. She lay there, listening to the sounds of the coming dawn, her hand held safely in his, and kept her vigil. Healing is not a straight line. It is a series of small, painful negotiations with a body that feels betrayed. The bullet wound in Elias's side was no longer a raw, open threat, but a tight, puckered knot of scarred flesh that pulled at his skin with every breath. He spent the long, quiet days at the hidden spring relearning how to move. He would stand, his hands braced against a cottonwood, and practice breathing. A full, deep breath was a fire poker jabbing his ribs. He would exhale on a low hiss, sweat beading on his forehead. He took tentative steps, walking the perimeter of their tiny, green sanctuary. His gait stiff, his body canted to one side. He was a man of action, a man whose survival depended on his physical competence, and this weakness felt like a rot. Alaqua, in contrast, seemed to draw strength from the earth itself. The deep, weary shadows under her eyes had faded. The haunted, hunted look was still there, but it was overlaid with something new, something that looked almost like resolve. She had washed her hair in the creek, and it hung in two thick, damp braids down her back, shining like obsidian in the filtered sunlight. She moved with a purpose that was both quiet and absolute. She tended the horses, checked their small supply of food, and watched Elias practice his pained, shuffling walk. There was a spring in her eyes now, a resilience that had been buried under the ash and the rope. They knew they could not stay. The spring was a respite, not a home. On the fourth morning, Elias nodded, his face grim. "Today, I can ride." They left the small paradise, pushing the horses up a steep, winding game trail to regain Madrone Pass. The pass itself was less a road than a deep, jagged crack in the mountains. The walls were sheer, rising hundreds of feet, stained with iron oxide that made them look like they were bleeding. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a single horse, and littered with stones that could turn an ankle or lame a mount. This was Elias's terrain. He was a man of rock and sky. As they rode, he taught her. His voice was a low rumble, never rising above the sound of the wind. "See that cut in the rock?" he'd murmur, pointing. "The wind is still there. It eddies, like water. A man waiting in ambush will stand there. He'll be out of the wind, so his horse won't get skittish, and he'll hear you comin' long before you hear him." He showed her how to read the slide rock on the slopes above, how to tell which rocks were new fallen and which had been stable for 100 years. His knowledge was of traps, of danger, of how men hunted other men. Alaqua, in turn, taught him the earth. Her voice was even quieter than his, a soft counter-melody. She would stop her mare, slide off, and point not at the towering cliffs, but at the ground. "Here," she'd say, brushing away the dirt to show a set of tracks so faint they were almost imaginary. A coyote passed, but he was running. He was not hunting. "Something a man is on the ridge above us." She showed him how a bent willow branch meant water was just beneath the surface. She pointed out a small, sun-baked plant with a thick root. "You can chew this," she said. "It is bitter, but it will quiet the stomach and stop thirst for a time." They were learning each other, a syllable at a time. He was the grammar of the rock. She was the vocabulary of the leaf. He was the harsh, declarative sentence. She was the soft, breathing comma. Together, they formed a new language of survival. That afternoon, they stopped. The sun was hot, and the pass had opened onto a high, wind-blasted plateau. They had been sparing with their food, and the hunger was a hollow ache that complemented the throb in Elias's side. They had one biscuit of hardtack left between them. Elias took it from the saddlebag. It was a dense, pale square, hard as fired brick. He held it for a moment, then, using the butt of his knife, he carefully broke it in two. The crack was sharp, loud in the immense silence. He handed one of the jagged halves to her. Their fingers brushed. It was not a meal. It was a vow. A dry, unsalted communion that said, "We will share what little we have. We will not abandon one another." They ate in silence, the hard biscuit demanding a long, slow effort to chew, forcing them to be patient, to be present. As they sat, Elias's gaze drifted down. into the vast, hazy valley to the east. He had been scanning it all day. Now, he saw what he had been dreading. From a copse of trees miles below, a single, thin column of smoke rose into the sky. It was not the scattered smoke of a traveling posse making brief camps. It was one steady, consistent plume, a base camp. "Kearney," Elias said, his voice flat. Alakwa looked, her eyes narrowing.
"He is not chasing," she said.
"No." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. "He's waiting. He's got the southern mouth of the pass blocked. He knows this is the only way through." A patient enemy. An enemy who was not in a hurry, was the most dangerous kind. Kearney was no longer just a bully. He was a spider, sitting in the center of his web. They mounted and rode on. The silence heavier now. The hardtack sat in their stomachs like a stone, and the sight of the smoke sat in their minds like a sentence. That night, they made a cold camp, nestled in a high cluster of boulders. A fire was impossible. The risk of being seen was too great. The cold was immediate and penetrating, seeping into their bones. Elias sat with his back to the rock, his rifle across his lap. He took his knife and a flat piece of dry madrone bark he had picked up. Alakwa watched him. In the fading, indigo light, his hands, though rough and calloused, moved with a surprising delicacy. He was carving. He was not a man of art, and the lines were deep and crude, but the image was unmistakable. A circle, wings, a sharp head, jagged lines of flame.
It was her symbol, Akete, the bird in the fire.
When he was finished, he didn't give it to her. He simply propped it against the rock face of their small camp, facing out into the darkness. It was a statement, left for the gods of the wilderness or for himself. Alakwa moved from her spot and sat beside him, their hips and shoulders touching. She looked at the small, rough carving for a long time. She did not say thank you. The words were too small. She just looked at it, and then at him. He had not just cut her down from the tree. He had seen her, truly seen her, and he understood the fire. He met her gaze.
"I see you,"
he whispered, his voice rough,
"and I believe."
Later, the temperature plummeted. The moon was a sliver of ice, and the stars were sharp, cold points of light. The wind howled over the rocks, shivering. Elias unrolled his heavy duster and, as he had at the spring, wrapped it around both of them. They huddled together, a single knot of warmth in a vast, freezing dark. This was their new intimacy, not the desperate, healing press of skin, but the shared, vital fight against the cold. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek against the top of her head. His hat tipped back. Her breath was a warm cloud against his neck.
"Elias,"
she whispered, the name a charm, a way of proving he was real. "Alakwa," he murmured back, his own voice a low vibration against her hair. They spoke their real names into the dark, a secret talisman against the hunting men and the cold. Empty night. The storm gathered. Dawn came, gray and brutal. A fine glittering frost coated the rocks. Elias left her with the horses, his hand on his pistol, and crept forward to scout the trail. He returned an hour later, his face carved from granite. He didn't speak, he just pointed at the ground. Alakwa came and knelt. The tracks were fresh, no more than an hour old. They were stark in the frosty, damp earth. She saw the heavy, shod prints of posse horses, their shoes worn and uneven, but mixed in with them, overlapping them, were other tracks. Precise, clean, the unmistakable government-issue nailed heel prints of cavalry mounts. "Dighton," she breathed, the word a puff of white vapor. "He's joined them," Elias said, his voice dead. "The law and the mob, they're one and the same." The net had not just tightened, it had become a solid wall. Kearney's men were blocking the pass below. And now, Dayton's patrol was sweeping the pass from the north. They were caught between the hammer and the anvil. "They'll be on us by noon," Elias said. He looked at the rock wall beside them. It was sheer, impossible. Alakwa looked up. "No," she said. She pointed to a thin, jagged line that cut across the face of the canyon wall, a path so narrow it looked like a crack. "There, the sky path, the snake's road." Elias followed her gaze. Viper's Ledge. He had seen it on his map, marked it as impassable. It was a ribbon of stone, barely 3 feet wide, that snaked for a quarter-mile along a sheer 1,000-foot drop. It was a place horses feared, a place men only crossed in their nightmares. "It's suicide," he breathed. "It is all we have," she replied. He looked back down the trail, where Dayton and Kearney were coming. Then he looked at her. He nodded. "Get the horses." They led the animals to the start of the ledge. The horses balked, their eyes rolling white, the smell of the sheer drop panicking them. Dusty planted his feet, trembling. "We can't," Elias said. "We must," Alakwa insisted. She took Dusty's bridle, whispering to him in her language, a low, cooing sound. She blindfolded both horses with strips of cloth torn from a blanket. Elias uncoiled his lariat. His side screamed in protest. He tied a solid bowline and looped it around Alakwa's waist, cinching it tight. He ran the rope's length, 30 feet, and tied the other end around his own waist. "If you fall, I pull you," he said, his voice a flat, hard promise. She met his gaze, her eyes fierce, the morning light reflecting in their dark depths. "If you fall," she said, "I pull you." He took Dusty's rein. She took the mare's. He stepped onto the ledge. The world vanished. There was only the narrow, frosted stone, the howling wind that tried to peel them from the rock, and the dizzying, empty abyss below. The frost made the stone slick, treacherous. His hands, gripping the reins, were already numb. The ledge groaned. A section of rock, loosened by the frost, creaked under Dusty's weight. The horse panicked, pulling back. Elias held the rein, his boots slipping. "One," Alakwa said from behind him, her voice sharp, cutting through the wind. "Breathe. 1." Elias let out his breath. 2, he responded. They moved in that rhythm, a single, shared breath. 1 step. 1. The horse's hoof skittered, sending a shower of gravel into the void. 2. Alakwa's hand, steady on the mare's flank. They moved, inch by agonizing inch. The wind screamed in their ears. The frost bit at their faces. Their numb hands felt like wooden blocks, uselessly gripping the slick leather. The rock itself seemed to be trying to shrug them off. They did not look down. They did not look back. They only looked forward, at the next foot of stone, and breathed. 1, 2, 1, 2. It was an eternity. It was 100 heartbeats. Then, his boot touched soft earth. The ledge widened, spilling out onto a broad, open plain. He stumbled forward, pulling Dusty with him. Alakwa and the mare followed, the rope going slack between them. They had crossed. They were on the other side. Elias leaned against his horse, his whole body shaking, his wound a white-hot fire. Alakwa collapsed to her knees, untying the blindfolds. The horses stood, legs splayed, slick with sweat and terror. They were on moraine flats, a vast, open, exposed field of gravel and stone, stretching as far as the eye could see. There was no cover, no water, no place to hide. But it was open, and it was the way south. There is no rest for the hunted. The relief of surviving Viper's Ledge was a fleeting thing, a single, sharp intake of breath before the race began again. Moraine Flats was a trap of a different kind. It was a vast, open killing field, a gravel-strewn plain that offered no cover, no sanctuary. To be on it was to be seen, and to be seen was to die. They pushed the horses hard, the animals' sides heaving, their hooves crunching a loud, desperate rhythm on the endless sea of stone. Every rock, every stunted bush, every shadow seemed to mock them with its inadequacy as a hiding place. Elias rode with his body twisted, his hand pressed against the aching wound in his side, his gaze constantly sweeping the high ridge they had just abandoned. He did not have to wait long. First came the sound, a thin, brassy note that cut through the wind, a bugle call. It was not a call to charge, but a simple, clear signal target acquired. It was the sound of disciplined, military pursuit. Then came the sight. On the highest point of Viper's Ledge, a figure on horseback appeared, silhouetted against the morning sky. Even at this distance, Elias could see the flash of yellow from a cavalry guidon, a small, swallow-tailed flag that whipped in the wind like a serpent's tongue. Dighton. Moments later, a second group appeared at the southern mouth of the pass, the way they had originally been headed, a disorganized, motley collection of riders. Kearney and his mob. The pincer had closed. They were caught.
They have us,
Alakwa said, her voice flat, devoid of panic. It was a simple statement of fact. Not yet, Elias grunted, his eyes darting across the barren landscape. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. They needed a miracle, or a plan. He had no faith in miracles. The wind, he said, his eyes narrowing. It's coming from the east, hard. He pointed to a dense, ugly cluster of greasewood bushes 100 yards ahead, their oily, dark green leaves trembling in the wind. There. He spurred Dusty into a painful, jarring trot. Alakwa was right beside him. When they reached the thicket, he swung down from the saddle, his sides screaming in protest. He fumbled in his saddlebag for his flint and steel. "What are you doing?" Alakwa asked, her eyes wide. "Buying time," he said, his knuckles white as he struck the flint. A spark fell into the dry tinder he'd gathered. It smoldered, then caught. He fed the tiny flame with dry grass, nursing it, protecting it from the wind. When it was strong enough, he pushed the burning tinder deep into the oily heart of the largest greasewood bush. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, explosive whoosh, the bush erupted in a column of thick, black, acrid smoke. The oil in the leaves burned hot and fast, and the east wind caught the smoke immediately, grabbing the dense plume and stretching it out like a long, dark curtain, pulling it directly across the flats, between them and their pursuers on the ridge. He had not started a wildfire. He had created a wall. "Go!" he yelled, clambering back into the saddle. "Follow the rockfall, keep to the hard stone." They plunged into the swirling, choking smoke. It was disorienting, blinding. The world was reduced to a gray, stinging fog. Alakwa took the lead, her instincts guiding her where her eyes could not. She navigated not by sight, but by feel, keeping the horses on a wide, ancient rock slide where their hooves would make less noise and leave fewer tracks than on the loose gravel. She leaned low over her mare's neck, her lips moving, whispering the old words, the prayers for shadow and silence that her people had used for 1,000 years. Behind them, on the ridge, the smoke created chaos. Kearney, impatient and enraged, saw the smoke as a trick. "They're trying to slip the net," he roared. He spurred his horse forward, firing his pistol blindly into the black cloud. Bang, bang, the shots were useless, swallowed by the smoke and the wind. Dighton, watching from his higher vantage point, cursed. This was not how a pursuit was conducted. This was a mob action. "Hold your fire, you fool!" he shouted down the ridge, his voice sharp with command. "You'll hit your own men. Form a skirmish line. We'll sweep the flats when it clears." The conflict between the two men was a crack in the wall of their pursuit. Elias and Alakwa, inside the smoke, heard the scattered shots and the distant, angry shouts. They were using that crack to slip through. Elias knew the smoke wouldn't last. He reined in his horse for a second, turning in the saddle. He slid his Winchester from its scabbard. He could just make out the shape of the cavalry on the high ridge, their forms wavering like ghosts in the thinning smoke. He saw the glint of the guidon, and beside it, the taller figure of the lieutenant. He was not a killer. He was a survivor. Killing Dayton would only bring the entire U.S. Army down on them, but he could send a message. He raised the rifle, found a steady aim, and let out a long, slow breath, just as he had taught himself 1,000 times hunting deer in the high country. He wasn't aiming for the man. He was aiming for the idea of the man. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. High on the ridge, Lieutenant Dayton's hat flew from his head as if plucked by an invisible hand, tumbling end over end before disappearing into a crevice. Dayton froze, his hand instinctively going to his bare head. The shot had been a whisper of wind past his ear. It was not a miss. It was a statement. It was a signature. It said, "I am here. I am watching you. And I can reach you whenever I choose." The professional soldier in Dayton recognized the skill, and a cold sliver of respect, mingled with dread, went through him. At the same time, Aliqua was enacting her own strategy. Near the edge of the rock slide, a section of the cliff face was unstable, a jumble of loose, fist-sized stones. While Elias took his shot, she dismounted and, with a grunt of effort, pushed with her shoulder against the largest key boulder. It resisted, then gave way. It wasn't an avalanche. It was a cascade. A few dozen rocks tumbled down the steep slope, clattering and bouncing, the sound magnified by the surrounding cliffs. In the disorienting smoke, the noise was terrifyingly ambiguous. It didn't sound like a natural rockfall. It sounded like more riders, a hidden party of reinforcements, their horses struggling for footing on the treacherous scree. The combination of the sniper's shot and the sound of a potential ambush was too much for Kearney's undisciplined men. One of them, a lanky youth with more bravado than sense, panicked. He wheeled his horse on the narrow trail, and the animal, already skittish, lost its footing. The man let out a yelp as he and the horse slid 10 feet down the slope in a shower of gravel, coming to rest in a thorny thicket. He wasn't hurt, but he was out of the fight. Dayton saw it all. His jaw was set like iron. His skirmish line was a shambles. His temporary allies were a liability, and his target was a professional marksman with allies of his own. This was no longer a simple pursuit. It was a tactical nightmare. "Back!" Dayton commanded, his voice ringing with fury and frustrated authority. "Back to the ridge, regroup." It was the opening they needed. The hesitation, the need for the professional to impose order on the chaos, gave them a window of 30 seconds. They spurred their horses out of the thinning smoke, not across the open flats, but down into the deep, sandy maw of the Arroyo del Lobo. The dry wash was a scar on the land, a twisting, sunken road carved by 1,000 years of flash floods. Its high, sandy banks immediately hid them from view. The soft sand muffled their horses' hoofprints, making their trail a whisper. It was a serpent's path, leading straight south, a direct route to the Mexican borderlands. They rode for hours, the adrenaline giving way to a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion. The arroyo was a relentless, monotonous trap, its high walls blocking out the sun, its sandy bottom sucking at the horse's strength. Elias's side was a constant, grinding agony. He was riding on pure will, his vision tunneling, his hands a numb, clumsy grip on the reins. Finally, as the sun began to set, the arroyo widened, the banks lowered. Ahead of them, they saw a collection of man-made shapes, stark against the purple sky. A sagging roofline, a single, leaning wall. A line of rotting wooden posts that marched into the desert and disappeared. Border Gate Wash, an old, abandoned customs post from a time when someone had thought this God-forsaken stretch of desert was worth taxing. The rotting posts marked the border. Freedom was 100 yards away. They urged their weary horses forward, a desperate hope flaring in their chests. They were going to make it. But hope is a fragile thing in the desert. As they cleared the last bend of the arroyo, a figure stepped out from behind the ruined wall of the customs house. Judd Kearney. He was alone, his face a mask of sweat-streaked grime and pure, venomous hatred. He held his pistol leveled, the long barrel looking like a black cannon in the fading light. "That's far enough," Kearney rasped, his voice a low, triumphant snarl. "The $50 is mine, and so is my property." His eyes, glinting like chips of obsidian, were fixed on Aliqua. "Hand over the girl, Marek, or I'll kill you both right here and drag her back over your dead body." Before Elias could respond, they heard the sound of more horses. Lieutenant Dighton and 2 of his troopers trotted into the wash, their faces grim. They took in the scene Kearney, the triumphant bully. Elias slumped in his saddle, pale and bleeding. Aliqua, her back ramrod straight, her face unreadable. Dighton did not draw his weapon. He simply sat his horse, his gaze moving from Kearney's pistol to Aliqua. And in that moment, he hesitated. His mission was to capture a fugitive, but he was a man who understood the nuances of power and politics. To bring this Apache girl back to the fort would be a victory. Yes, but it would also be a problem. There would be hearings, reports, questions about his association with a vigilante like Kearney. She was a political hot potato, a symbol that could either make his career or burn it to the ground. He looked at her, not as a person, but as a column of figures in a ledger, a calculation of risk and reward. His eyes darkened. The world seemed to hold its breath. The 4 men, the 1 woman, all frozen in a tableau of imminent violence. It was Aliqua who broke the spell. She did not wait for Elias to defend her or for Dighton to make his decision. She had been a prize, a lure, a fugitive, a patient. Now, she was done being defined by others. She swung her leg over her saddle and slid to the ground. She stood on her own 2 feet, on the hard, unforgiving earth. She took a half-step forward, into the open space between the men. She drew her shoulders back, her chin held high, her gaze fixed not on Kearney's gun, but on Dayton's face. "I am not a prize," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the twilight with the clarity of a bell. It was not a plea. It was not a defense. It was a declaration of existence, a statement of a truth so fundamental that it challenged the very foundation of their conflict. And in the sudden, profound silence that followed her words, the wind, for the first time that day, completely died. The silence that followed Aliqua's declaration was a physical thing. A glass dome dropped over the wash, trapping them all in the amber light of the setting sun. For a single, eternal heartbeat, no one moved. Kearney's face was a mask of confusion, his simple, brutal calculus of greed and power short-circuited by a truth he could not comprehend. Dighton's expression was unreadable, the pragmatic officer weighing the cost of a dead body against the inconvenience of a living one. Elias saw the moment. He saw the flicker of indecision in Dayton's eyes. He saw Kearney's knuckles whiten on his pistol. He knew this fragile, perfect stillness was the only chance they would ever get. Their plan, conceived in whispered words and shared glances on the trail, had been for a moment just like this, a moment of distraction, a moment of choice, with a motion that was almost casual, a weary shrug of his shoulders. Elias let the heavy duster coat he wore slide to the ground. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was the signal. Aliqua did not wait to see if anyone understood. Her hand, already in her pocket, closed around a small, leather-wrapped bundle. It was not a weapon. It was a second fire starter. This one packed not with oily tinder, but with a mixture of sulfur, pine pitch, and dried milkweed fluff. She pulled the cord. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. It did not erupt in flame, but in a dense, blindingly white cloud of smoke. It was not the black, choking smoke of the greasewood. It was a theatrical, disorienting fog that billowed out, thick and cloying, a sudden ghostly wall between them and their pursuers. Kearney's horse, already on edge, screamed in terror. It was a creature of the open desert, and the sudden, unnatural blindness sent it into a primal panic. It reared, its front hooves lashing the air, its eyes rolling white. Kearney, caught off guard, fought for control, his carefully aimed pistol waving wildly. He fired, a single, panicked shot. The bullet tore a harmless path through the top of the smoke cloud, the sound of the gunshot swallowed by the sudden, thick silence of the fog. "Hold your fire!" Dighton's voice was a whip-crack of command, but it was already too late. The discipline of his patrol was fracturing, faced with Kearney's chaos. But Dighton was not a man who simply reacted. He was a man who acted. In that split second, the lieutenant made a choice. It was not a choice for justice or for mercy. It was a choice for order. He raised his own Colt revolver. Not at Elias, not at Kearney, but at the rickety supply wagon Kearney had tethered to the ruined customs house. He fired once. The shot was not loud, but it was precise. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood. The front wheel of the wagon, its spokes shattered, collapsed. The axle dropped to the ground with a groan of tortured metal, and the entire wagon lurched, effectively blocking Kearney's most direct path of pursuit. Dighton had not chosen a side. He had simply and efficiently cleared the board of its most unpredictable piece. Elias didn't wait to see the outcome. The moment the smoke bloomed, he spurred Dusty, not forward, but left. A hard, wrenching turn. He drove the horse directly between Aliqua and the direction of Kearney's wild shot. He was her shield. It was a pure, unthinking instinct. He heard a sound like a giant bee buzzing past his ear, and then a hot, wet slash of fire tore across his left bicep. He grunted, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain. He looked down. A dark, crimson line had bloomed on his sleeve, the fabric already turning black with blood. The wound was not deep, a graze, but it was messy, and the shock of it sent a wave of dizziness through him. He was already faltering, his vision blurring. When Aliqua moved, she was on her mare in a single, fluid motion. She spurred the horse not away from him, but directly toward him, until their knees were touching. She reached out, grabbing the collar of his shirt. She pulled him upright in his saddle, her face a mask of fierce, desperate resolve. At the same time, she pressed the heavy wool of her own blanket against his bleeding arm. A crude, immediate pressure dressing. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice cutting through the fog in his mind. She pulled him and his horse closer until their two mounts were moving as one, a single entity of 4 heaving bodies and 8 pounding hooves. They were a songma, a double rider, a unit forged in fire and smoke. Through a thinning patch in the white cloud, Kearney saw them. His face was a contorted mask of pure rage, his prize slipping away. He finally brought his panicked horse under control and charged forward, his pistol raised again. "You're not getting away," he bellowed. But Dighton was there. The lieutenant had moved his horse to block Kearney's path. He did not say a word. He simply raised his own pistol and leveled it. Not at Elias or Aliqua, but directly at Judd Kearney's chest. The message was unmistakable. "It is over. Stand down." Kearney stared, his mouth agape, at the cold, steady barrel of the cavalry pistol. He looked from Dighton's icy, impassive face to the disappearing shapes in the smoke, the $50, the girl, the victory all turning to ash. He let out a final, inarticulate roar of pure, impotent fury, but he did not charge. Aliqua did not look back. She saw her opening. She wrenched her mare's head to the right, pulling Elias and Dusty with her. They plunged off the main track and down into the shallow, rocky bed of a small, seasonal creek that fed into the wash. There was a splash of water, a clatter of rolling stones, and then the last of the white smoke swirled away behind them, revealing an open path. Ahead of them, stark in the last, dying light of dusk, stood the line of rotting posts. The border. A new wind, a warm wind from the south, from the vast, open deserts of Mexico, washed over them. It felt different. It felt like a promise. Elias was shaking, not just from the cold of the evening, but from the shock and the blood loss. The world was beginning to tilt again, the strength that had carried him this far finally deserting him. He slumped forward in the saddle, his head resting against his horse's neck. "So cold," he whispered, the words a faint, rattling breath. Aliqua pulled her horse to a halt. In the deep twilight, she leaned across the space between their saddles. She took the collar of his heavy, fleece-lined duster, the one he had dropped as their signal, which she had scooped from the ground in a single, fluid motion. With a strength born of pure desperation, she pulled him toward her. She wrapped the heavy coat around both of their shoulders, creating a shared cocoon of wool and leather, pulling him into her heat, into her life. She pressed her face close to his, her lips brushing the shell of his ear. Her whisper was a fierce, desperate, and loving command, a counterpoint to the drumbeat of their horses' hooves as they began to move again. "Make me warm," she breathed. "Don't stop." They crossed the invisible line marked by the rotting posts, their two horses moving as one, their two bodies wrapped in a single coat, the sounds of the wash behind them, the angry shouts. The clatter of a broken wagon faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. Before them, a new land opened up, a landscape of unknown dangers and a single, fragile, incandescent hope. They rode on into the gathering darkness. Two figures merged into one, their shared, hot breath mingling with the warm southern wind. Her whispered words hung in the air, a promise made at the very moment the door to a new life swung open. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love to connect and share our thoughts with you. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really want to support us, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.